On the 18th of December, 1814, the hired carriage deposited Evelora Grey at the threshold of Blackwood Hall, a palace so magnificent in its winter grandeur that she was absolutely certain the driver had delivered her to the wrong address entirely. The letter had promised nothing more than a governess position for a single child, written in careful script that bore no signature, and sealed with unmarked crimson wax that told her nothing of who might have remembered her existence when society had worked so thoroughly to erase it. She had unfolded that letter 63 times during her journey north through frozen roads and bitter wind, tracing each measured sentence with trembling fingers, searching for some hidden warning that this opportunity was merely another trap disguised as mercy. December, wind pulled sharply at her navy traveling dress, the finest garment she still possessed, though its hem showed mud from 3 counties, and its collar had been turned twice to hide the fraying, and she pressed her single carpet bag against her ribs as though it contained treasures, rather than the pitiful sum of everything she owned in this world. Snow drifted across the marble terrace in soft white veils, settling on holly wreaths and crimson ribbons that decorated windows stretching 3 stories toward a pewter sky, and Evelora felt something cold and sharp lodge itself beneath her breastbone, because this was not a modest household seeking help with unruly children. The columns alone rose higher than the chapel where she had been baptized, and the windows glowed with candlelight that spoke of wealth beyond anything she had encountered in her 26 years. And somewhere beyond the facade she heard voices singing a Christmas carol that made her throat tighten with longing for something she could not name. She should turn around. She should find the driver before he vanished down that impossible avenue of lime trees, and beg him to carry her back to the coaching inn where she might search for employment more suited to a disgraced governess with no references, no family, and no future beyond what desperation could scrape together. But Evelora had learned during her years in service that survival required a particular species of courage that had nothing to do with confidence and everything to do with having absolutely no alternative. And so she moved forward on legs that felt uncertain beneath her skirts, her boots leaving small prints in fresh snow that probably cost more to maintain than her annual salary had been at the house where her life had shattered. The enormous doors swung open before she could raise her hand to knock, and a housekeeper with iron grey hair swept back beneath a severe cap regarded her with immediate and poorly concealed disappointment. Mrs. Penelope Stroud, she would learn within the hour, had been expecting someone taller, someone fairer, someone whose appearance suggested they might be worthy of whatever mysterious purpose had summoned this unremarkable creature to their doorstep. Evelora was led through corridors panelled in dark wood and hung with portraits of ancestors whose painted eyes seemed to judge her passage, past servants who paused in their Christmas preparations to whisper behind their hands, up a sweeping staircase whose marble steps gleamed like ice beneath her worn soles, until at last she stood before carved double doors, and Mrs. Stroud's hand hesitated for just a moment on the brass handle before pushing them open, and everything Evelora thought she understood about why she had been summoned here shattered like glass beneath a hammer. The nursery stretched before her in winter light, decorated with garlands of evergreen and white ribbons, a fire burning cheerfully in an enormous hearth, and toys scattered across carpet so thick her boots sank into it. And standing perfectly still in the center of all that careful Christmas warmth was a small boy dressed in a velvet suit the color of midnight, with pale skin and dark curls and grey eyes that looked ancient in his young face. He had not spoken in 22 months. They would tell her later, not since the afternoon his mother closed her eyes for the final time. But in that suspended moment before anyone could make introductions, before Mrs. Stroud could explain Evelora's presence or recite the household rules, the child looked directly at her with absolute certainty and spoke a single word that would echo through marble halls and change the course of 3 lives forever. Mother, hey, quick question, how are you feeling right now? Thank you so much for being here. It really means the world to me. I'm working toward 1,000 subscribers, and if this story is already pulling at your heart, please hit that subscribe button for Duke's Royal Library, smash the like, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. It helps more than you know. Alright, thank you. Now let's get back to the story. The word hung suspended in the air between them like a crystal ornament catching light, impossible and yet undeniable, and Evelora felt her knees buckle beneath her without any conscious command from her mind. She sank to the carpet with her hands braced against the floor to keep from collapsing entirely, and the child stood watching her with his small face solemn and expectant, as though he had been waiting for her specifically and was satisfied she had finally arrived. His hand extended toward her, palm upward, fingers spread in patient invitation, and something in that gesture broke through the shocked paralysis gripping her chest. She found herself reaching out to take it, even as her rational mind screamed that this was madness, that she had never laid eyes on this boy before this heartbeat, that she could not possibly be what he had named her. His fingers were small and cool as they wrapped around hers with surprising strength, and something inside Evelora that had been locked away for months cracked open at the contact, some carefully sealed door she had built against the pain of wanting what could never be hers. Behind her, Mrs. Stroud made a sound like steam escaping a kettle, sharp and hissing and full of barely restrained fury, and Evelora heard footsteps converging in the corridor beyond, voices rising in urgent whispers that would soon become accusations. She could not turn to face them. She could not look away from those grey eyes that held her with such conviction, such perfect certainty that she was exactly who he had declared her to be. Through the tall windows she saw snow falling harder now, thick flakes tumbling past glass to blanket the grounds in white that would muffle all sound. And in that strange crystalline moment she felt as though time itself had paused to bear witness to whatever impossible thing was unfolding here. "What is the meaning of this, Mrs. Stroud demanded, her voice cutting through the hush like a blade through silk, and Evelora heard the rustle of her stiff skirts as she stepped closer, felt the weight of her suspicion pressing down like a physical force against her shoulders. "Who are you? What trickery have you employed to make him speak? What dark art is this?" But Evelora possessed no answers, could not have spoken even if she had them, because Theo had stepped closer still, and was studying her face with an intensity that stole her breath, his free hand rising to touch her cheek, with fingers that trembled slightly before settling against her skin with unexpected warmth. She felt tears gathering behind her eyes, absurd and unwelcome, because she had trained herself through months of accusations and dismissal, not to cry, not when lies were spoken about her character, not when doors closed in her face, not when she walked away from the only employment she would likely ever find, with nothing but slander trailing behind her like a shadow. "Send for his grace immediately, Mrs. Stroud commanded someone, and Evelora heard running footsteps retreating down the corridor, and she understood then that she had stumbled into something far larger than a simple governess position, that the anonymous letter had delivered her not to a household in need of help, but to the very center of a storm she could not yet comprehend. The snow fell harder beyond the windows, blanketing the world in white that muffled all sound except the crackle of the fire and the hammering of Evelora's heart, and Theo spoke again. Just one more word, softer this time, a plea rather than a proclamation. "Stay." And despite everything, her frightened mind was screaming, despite the danger gathering like thunderclouds in the faces of servants watching from the doorway, despite the certain knowledge that she should flee before whatever reckoning approached, destroyed what little remained of her reputation. Evelora found herself nodding, found her voice at last, found a single word to offer in return. Yes, she heard him before she saw him, the sharp, decisive footsteps of a man accustomed to absolute obedience echoing through the corridor like the approach of judgment itself. And Evelora rose to her feet with Theo's small hand still gripping the fabric of her skirt as though he feared she might vanish should he release her for even an instant. The servants parted like water before the prow of a ship, and then he was there in the doorway, and Evelora understood immediately why the household moved with such careful deference, why the very air seemed to thicken with his presence. Lord Stefan Blackwood stood taller than she had imagined a duke might stand, his dark hair swept back from a face that appeared carved from something harder than flesh, and his grey eyes so like his son's, yet so different in their cold fury fixed upon her with an intensity that made her want to step backward, to flee, to become as invisible as she had always been. He wore formal dark attire that spoke of interrupted correspondence and duties abandoned, and the firelight caught the sharp angles of his jaw, the tension in his shoulders, the barely contained rage that simmered beneath a mask of aristocratic control. "What?" he said, and his voice emerged lower than she had expected, rougher, as though the words themselves cost him something to speak. "Is the meaning of this spectacle?" Evelora opened her mouth to respond, but found her voice had abandoned her, stolen by the weight of his accusation and the impossibility of explaining something she did not herself understand. She had not asked to be called mother by a child she had never met, had not orchestrated whatever strange recognition had passed between them, had arrived with nothing more than desperate hope and an anonymous letter that now felt like a snare closing around her throat. "Your Grace, Mrs." Stroud interjected with obvious satisfaction. This woman arrived without proper introduction, and within moments had somehow provoked the young master to speak, though what manipulation she employed, I cannot begin to fathom. Stefan's gaze did not waver from Evelora's face, searching it as though he might find answers written there if only he looked hard enough, and she forced herself to meet those eyes despite every instinct screaming at her to look away, to submit, to accept whatever judgment he chose to render. "I employed nothing," she heard herself say, and the words emerged steadier than she felt, carrying a dignity she had not known she still possessed after weeks of humiliation and dismissal. "I do not know your son. I have never seen him before this hour, and I am as bewildered by his words as anyone in this room." But she could feel Theo pressing closer against her leg, feel his small fingers tightening their grip, and something fierce rose within her chest, something that had nothing to do with reason, and everything to do with the silent plea she sensed radiating from this child who had chosen her for reasons beyond her comprehension. Stefan's expression flickered for just an instant, and Evelora saw something beneath the fury, something raw and wounded and desperately afraid, and she understood then that his anger was not truly meant for her but for the hope that Theo's single word had awakened after 22 months of silence and grief. Outside, the storm had settled into steady snowfall, flakes pressing against the windows like 1,000 small hands seeking entry, and between them stood a little boy who had not released his hold on either his father's attention or Evelora's skirt, a bridge of flesh and longing connecting two strangers who did not yet know how completely their lives were about to intertwine. The nursery erupted into chaos the moment Theo's voice faded into silence, that single word still hanging in the air like smoke from a candle just extinguished, and Mrs. Stroud's face transformed from stern disapproval into something resembling genuine shock as she stepped backward with her hand pressed against her throat. Within seconds, footsteps thundered through the corridors from every direction, servants abandoning their posts to converge on the nursery where the impossible had just occurred, and Evelora remained kneeling on the carpet with Theo's small hand clasped in hers, unable to move or speak or do anything except stare at this child who had shattered 22 months of silence with a word meant for someone he could not possibly remember. A housemaid appeared in the doorway, her face flushed from running, followed by a footman whose livery was still dusted with snow from outdoor duties, and behind them came voices rising in urgent whispers that would not remain whispers for long. Mrs. Stroud had recovered her composure enough to begin issuing orders in clipped tones, sending one servant to fetch Lady Sabine and another to locate his Grace immediately, though her gaze never left Evelora's face, and the suspicion there burned hot enough to scorch. Theo seemed oblivious to the commotion swirling around them, his attention fixed entirely on Evelora, with those solemn grey eyes that held far too much understanding for a child of 4 years, and when she tried gently to release his hand, he tightened his grip and shook his head slowly, deliberately, as though he knew she was considering flight and would not permit it. The sound of rapid footsteps approached, different from the others, heavier and more authoritative, and every servant in the corridor fell silent at once, as though some invisible command had been issued. Evelora felt the change in atmosphere before she saw its cause, felt the way the air itself seemed to grow dense and charged with tension, and then Lord Stefan Blackwood filled the doorway with his presence, and his fury and his grief barely contained beneath aristocratic control. He wore no coat, his white shirt still bearing ink stains from interrupted correspondence, and his dark hair appeared hastily pushed back from his face as though he had been running his hands through it repeatedly, and when his gaze landed on his son, kneeling beside a stranger, his expression shifted through a dozen emotions too quickly for Evelora to name them all. For a long moment no one moved, no one breathed, the entire household suspended in that terrible space between hope and fear, where miracles and disasters feel exactly the same. And then Stefan spoke in a voice so low and dangerous it made Evelora's blood run cold. "What have you done?" he asked, and she understood he was not seeking information but making an accusation. And she lifted her chin despite the terror coursing through her veins and met his gaze with the only weapon she possessed, which was the simple truth. "Nothing," she said quietly, and Theo's hand tightened around hers as though he were offering her strength she did not know she needed. Absolutely nothing at all. The hours that followed felt like drowning in slow motion, each minute stretching into eternity, as Mrs. Stroud interrogated Evelora with questions that circled endlessly back to the same impossible accusation. that she had somehow orchestrated Theo's speech through manipulation or trickery or some form of deception the housekeeper could not yet identify, but was determined to uncover. They had moved to a small sitting room adjacent to the nursery, though Theo had refused to be separated from Evelora, and now sat pressed against her side in a chair too large for his small frame, his hand still wrapped around two of her fingers as though she were an anchor keeping him from drifting away. Through the windows the snow continued falling, blanketing Blackwood Hall in white that muffled all sound from the outside world, and Evelora learned the shape of the household's grief through Mrs. Stroud's clipped recitation of facts delivered like blows meant to test her reaction. The Duchess Catherine had died in February of 1813 after a brief illness that came on suddenly and took her before anyone could prepare for the loss, and Theo had been with her at the end, had watched his mother's breathing grow shallow and stop, and had not spoken a single word since that afternoon. His Grace had retreated into work and duty and a coldness that kept everyone at a careful distance, and the household had learned to move through their days with quiet efficiency that did not disturb the tomb-like silence that had settled over what had once been a home filled with laughter. Mrs. Stroud's eyes were sharp and searching as she recounted these details, watching for any sign that Evelora had known them already, any hint that she had prepared for this moment through research or gossip, or some elaborate scheme whose purpose remained unclear. But Evelora could only shake her head and offer the same impossible truth again and again, that she had arrived knowing nothing except what the anonymous letter had told her, that she was as bewildered as anyone by Theo's recognition of her, that she possessed no explanation for why a child who had been silent for nearly 2 years had chosen this moment and this woman to break his silence. Theo stirred against her side, his small body warm through the fabric of her dress, and when she looked down at him he was watching her face with that same intense focus he had shown in the nursery, as though he were memorizing every detail of her features. Mrs. Stroud rose abruptly, her skirts rustling with barely contained frustration, and announced she would inform His Grace that Miss Grey would remain in the nursery wing under careful supervision until her purpose here could be properly determined, and the way she spoke the word purpose made it clear she believed Evelora's intentions were anything but innocent. After she departed, the room fell into silence, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the soft sound of Theo's breathing, and Evelora realized with a start that she was trembling, that the shock of the past hours had finally caught up with her body, even as her mind struggled to process everything that had happened since she stepped through those enormous doors. Stefan Blackwood stood in his study with his hands braced against the mahogany desk, staring down at correspondence he could no longer focus on, his mind circling endlessly around the impossible thing he had witnessed in the nursery. And when the door opened without a knock, he did not need to look up to know it was his sister, because only Sabine would dare enter his private sanctuary uninvited. She closed the door behind her with deliberate care, the kind of quiet that announced she had come prepared for battle, and Stefan straightened slowly to face her with his jaw tight and his hands curling into fists at his sides. "It was I," Sabine said without preamble, her voice steady despite the color rising in her cheeks. "I who sent the letter, I who arranged for Miss Grey to come here, and before you unleash whatever fury you have been storing since you left that nursery, I ask only that you hear my reasons." Stefan felt something cold and sharp lodge itself beneath his ribs, betrayal mixing with a rage he could not quite articulate, and for a long moment he could only stare at his sister, while the implications of her confession rearranged themselves into a pattern he had not anticipated. Sabine lifted her chin in that way she had always done when facing their father's disapproval, that gesture of defiance wrapped in dignity, and continued speaking before he could find words to stop her. "I lost my Edmund 6 years ago," she said, and her voice cracked slightly on her son's name before she forced it steady again. "He was 3 years old, and he slipped away from a fever that no physician could break, and I would have given anything, Stefan, anything at all, to have had more time with him, to have heard his voice one more day, one more hour." Stefan felt his anger waver, felt the familiar weight of shared grief pressing down on them both, but he pushed it away because grief was easier to bear than hope, and hope was what Sabine was offering him, and he could not afford to believe in it. "Theo has been silent for 22 months, she continued, her hands clasped tightly before her in a pose that reminded him of their mother. "And you have tried nothing that mattered. You have hired nursemaids and physicians who saw only a broken child to be managed, rather than a wounded soul to be healed. And when I learned of Miss Grey through Lady Pemberton, when I investigated her dismissal and found nothing but jealousy and lies behind it, when I read of her gift with children who others had deemed hopeless, I knew I had to try. The words struck him like physical blows, each one landing with precision against the carefully constructed walls he had built around his heart since Catherine's death. And Stefan turned away from his sister because he could not bear to see the truth of his failures reflected in her eyes. The gossip spread through Blackwood Hall's servants' quarters like frost creeping across a window pane, quiet and inexorable, and impossible to stop once it had begun. And by the morning of December 20th, every maid and footman and kitchen worker knew that the plain governess, who had arrived 3 days prior, had somehow made the young master speak, and that his grace did not know what to make of it, and that Mrs. Stroud was convinced some dark art had been employed. Lady Arabella Caraway heard the whispers when she arrived for tea that afternoon, her carriage pulling up to the snow-covered terrace with the kind of casual elegance that spoke of someone who knew she belonged here, and she smiled that particular smile she had perfected over years of navigating aristocratic circles, the one that looked like warmth but cut like a blade. She found Stefan in the drawing-room reviewing estate accounts, and she settled onto the sofa across from him with her lavender silk skirts arranged in graceful folds that drew the eye without seeming to demand it, and she inquired after Theo with precisely the right note of concern that implied intimacy without overstepping propriety. Stefan answered in monosyllables, his attention still fixed on the papers before him, but Arabella was patient and skilled, and knew that sometimes the most effective attacks came wrapped in sympathy. "I understand you have hired a new governess," she said, her voice carrying just enough curiosity to seem natural. "Mrs. Stroud mentioned something about her being rather ordinary, though I suppose that matters little if she is competent with children." The barb landed softly, wrapped in silk, and Stefan's pen paused for just a fraction of a second before continuing across the page, and Arabella filed away that hesitation for future use. She had been maneuvering herself closer to Stefan Blackwood for 2 years now, ever since an appropriate mourning period had passed after Catherine's death, and she would not let some plain nobody from nowhere disrupt carefully laid plans simply because a traumatized child had spoken a word that meant nothing. In the nursery wing 3 floors above, Evelora sat on the carpet with Theo, building a tower from wooden blocks while winter light streamed through the tall windows and painted everything in shades of silver and gold. And she did not yet know that Lady Arabella Caraway had arrived or that gossip was spreading her name through the household like poison through water. Theo handed her another block, his movements careful and deliberate, and when their fingers touched he smiled, a small private expression that transformed his solemn face into something almost luminous. The tower was nearly complete when the nursery door opened and Stefan entered, still carrying the tension of interrupted work in his shoulders, and he stopped short at the sight of them together on the floor. This plain woman in her worn dress, and his son in his velvet suit, both of them covered in afternoon light, and looking more at peace than Stefan had seen Theo look in 22 months. Evelora began to rise, but Stefan raised a hand to stop her, and for a long moment he simply watched them, something shifting behind his eyes that might have been the first crack in the ice that had encased his heart since February of 1813, and when Theo looked up at his father and said quietly, clearly, "Building," Stefan felt his carefully constructed world tilt on its axis and begin to fall. "Why haven't you subscribed yet? I pour my heart into these stories, weaving every emotion, every word, every character's pain and joy, because I believe in creating something beautiful that touches your soul. If these chapters are moving you, if you're feeling what Evelora feels, if you're hoping alongside Stefan and Theo, then please hit that subscribe button. It costs you nothing, but means everything to me. Your subscription is what allows me to keep creating these stories, to keep bringing you into worlds where love conquers grief and hope defeats despair. Don't just watch and leave. Be part of this journey. Subscribe now and support a storyteller who genuinely cares about every single person who takes the time to read and watch these words. Thank you from the depths of my heart. Dowager Countess Margaret Ravenscar arrived at Blackwood Hall on the afternoon of December 22nd in a carriage so imposing it seemed to cast shadows across the snow-covered drive, and every servant who witnessed her descent from that gleaming black equipage understood immediately that judgment had arrived, dressed in silk and ermine. She was Stefan's great-aunt on his mother's side, a woman whose influence extended through half the aristocratic families in England, and whose approval or disapproval could make or break reputations with nothing more than a raised eyebrow at the opera. Missus Stroud greeted her in the entrance hall with barely concealed relief, no doubt hoping the dowager would accomplish what she herself could not, which was to expose whatever deception Evelora must surely be employing to maintain her position. The dowager moved through Blackwood Hall like winter itself, her silver hair swept into an elaborate arrangement beneath a black velvet bonnet, her posture so perfect it made everyone around her feel crooked by comparison, and when she entered the nursery where Evelora sat reading to Theo by the fire, the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. "So," the dowager said without preamble, her voice carrying the crisp precision of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "You are the young woman who has caused such unprecedented disruption to my great-nephew's household." Evelora rose immediately, her worn day dress suddenly feeling even more threadbare under that aristocratic scrutiny, and she curtsied with as much grace as she could manage, while her heart hammered against her ribs. The dowager circled her slowly, examining her from every angle with eyes that missed nothing, taking in the frayed cuffs and turned collar, and the stubborn pride that kept Evelora's chin lifted despite the obvious power imbalance. "Plain," the dowager pronounced at last, though whether this was criticism or observation remained unclear, "unremarkable in every visible way, and yet my great-nephew's son speaks to you when he has been silent as a tomb for nearly 2 years. She turned her attention to Theo, who had risen from his chair and now stood watching this formidable stranger with that same solemn intensity he brought to everything. "Come here, child," the dowager commanded, but Theo did not move, his small hand reaching instead for Evelora's skirt, his fingers curling into the fabric with familiar determination. The dowager's eyebrows rose fractionally, the only sign that she found this behavior noteworthy, and she lowered herself into a chair with the careful deliberation of someone whose joints no longer bent as easily as they once had. "Tell me, Theo Blackwood," she said, her voice gentling slightly though her gaze remained sharp. "Why do you call this woman mother when your true mother rests in the family vault?" The room fell silent except for the crackling fire, and Evelora felt her breath catch because surely Theo would not answer. Surely he would retreat into the safety of silence rather than try to explain something that defied all rational explanation. But Theo looked up at the dowager with those ancient grey eyes and spoke 3 words that would seal Evelora's fate. "She came back," he said simply, and the dowager countess's mask of aristocratic control cracked just enough to reveal something that might have been understanding. The days between the dowager's visit and Christmas Eve passed with a gentleness Evelora had not known was possible, as though Blackwood Hall itself had decided to exhale after holding its breath for 22 months. The dowager had departed with instructions that Miss Grey was to remain in her position until further notice, and though her words had been characteristically cryptic, something in her tone had suggested approval wrapped in caution. Stefan began appearing in the nursery at odd hours, initially with excuses about checking on Theo's progress, but increasingly with no explanation at all, and Evelora would look up from helping Theo with his letters or building yet another block tower to find the Duke watching them with an expression she could not quite decipher. On the afternoon of December 23rd, Stefan arrived carrying a wooden horse he had carved himself years ago, when he still believed in the simple joys of fatherhood, and he knelt on the carpet beside his son for the first time since Catherine's death, and showed Theo how the horse's head could nod when you pressed a hidden spring in its mane. Evelora had retreated to the window seat to give them space, her heart aching with something too complex to name as she watched father and son bent together over that simple toy, and when Stefan looked up and caught her watching, the smile that touched his lips was tentative but genuine. They began taking tea together in the afternoons, the 3 of them, an informal ritual that scandalized Mrs. Stroud, but which no one seemed inclined to stop, and Evelora learned that Stefan took his tea black with no sugar, that he had a dry wit that emerged when he felt safe enough to lower his guard, that grief had not destroyed the man he had been but merely buried him beneath layers of protective ice. Theo blossomed under this new attention from his father, his vocabulary expanding daily as he pointed to objects and demanded their names, his laughter returning in small, bright bursts that seemed to startle even him. One evening, as Evelora prepared Theo for bed, Stefan lingered in the doorway, watching her smooth the coverlet and brush the dark curls back from his son's forehead, and when she turned to leave she found him still there, his expression raw and unguarded in the candlelight. "Thank you," he said quietly, and those 2 words carried the weight of everything he could not yet say. all the hope and fear and desperate gratitude that came with watching your child return to life. Evelora felt her throat tighten with emotion. She dared not examine too closely, and she nodded once before slipping past him into the corridor, her heart racing with the dangerous realization that she was falling in love with a duke who could never be hers. The Christmas Eve ball transformed Blackwood Hall into something from a fairy tale, every surface gleaming with candlelight and evergreen, the ballroom filled with aristocrats in silks and jewels who had come to see if the rumors about young Theo Blackwood's miraculous recovery were true. Evelora had intended to remain in the nursery wing, to avoid the spectacle entirely, but Lady Sabine had arrived at her door 3 hours before the ball began, with a dress of deep emerald silk that she claimed no longer fit her, but which Evelora suspected had been purchased specifically for this purpose. "You will not hide," Sabine had said firmly, brooking no argument as she helped Evelora into the gown and pinned her dark hair into an elegant arrangement that made her look almost pretty. Now Evelora stood at the top of the grand staircase looking down at a sea of unfamiliar faces, her hands trembling in her borrowed gloves, and when she began to descend, she felt every eye in the room turn toward her, with varying degrees of curiosity and judgment. Stefan stood near the fireplace in conversation with several gentlemen, magnificent in his formal black evening clothes, and when he looked up and saw her, his expression transformed into something that made her breath catch. But before he could move toward her, Lady Arabella Caraway materialized at his elbow, resplendent in crimson silk that made Evelora's borrowed gown seem drab by comparison, and she laughed at something Stefan said with her hand resting possessively on his sleeve. Evelora felt something cold settle in her chest as she watched them together, watched how easily Arabella belonged in this world of wealth and privilege, how perfectly she fit at Stefan's side in ways a disgraced governess never could. The evening wore on in a blur of introductions Evelora would not remember, polite conversations that felt like examinations, and always Arabella's presence, hovering at the edges of her vision like a beautiful threat. It was nearly midnight when Theo appeared on the grand staircase in his nightshirt, having escaped from his nursemaid, and the ballroom fell silent as every guest turned to stare at the child who had been silent for so long. He descended the stairs with surprising confidence for someone so small, his gaze searching the crowd until it landed on Evelora, and he walked directly to her through that sea of aristocratic strangers without hesitation. "Mother," he said clearly, loudly, and then turned to face Lady Arabella Caraway with a child's perfect honesty. "You are not her. You cannot stay." Stefan moved then, crossing the ballroom in long strides, and when he reached them, he knelt before his son with every eye in the room watching, and said in a voice that carried to every corner, "You are absolutely right, Theo. She is the one who belongs here." The winter garden lay silent beneath fresh snow, the world muffled and white and holding its breath, and Evelora stood among the dormant rose bushes wrapped in a borrowed cloak, while her heart threatened to shatter in her chest. She had fled the ballroom after Stefan's declaration, unable to bear the weight of all those staring eyes, the whispers that had erupted like wildfire, the impossible hope that threatened to undo her completely. Behind her she heard footsteps crunching through snow, and she did not need to turn to know it was Stefan, could feel his presence the way she had learned to feel approaching storms. "Why did you run?" he asked, and his voice was rough with something that might have been anger, or might have been fear, and when she finally turned to face him, she saw both emotions warring in his expression. "Because I am nobody," Evelora said, and the words came out sharper than she intended, edged with all the pain of a lifetime spent being overlooked and dismissed and told she was not enough. "I am a disgraced governess, with no family, no fortune, no future beyond what charity provides, and you are a duke, and your son may call me mother, but we both know I have no right to that title." Stefan closed the distance between them in 3 long strides, and suddenly he was close enough that she could see the candlelight from the ballroom windows reflected in his eyes, could see the way his jaw was tight with emotion barely contained. "You have every right," he said fiercely, "because you are the one who brought my son back to me when I had given up hope entirely. You are the one who saw past his silence to the child still fighting to be heard. You are the one who made me remember what it felt like to hope and fear and love again." His hands came up to frame her face, his touch gentle, despite the intensity in his voice, and Evelora felt tears sliding down her cheeks before she could stop them. "I am terrified," Stefan whispered, his forehead resting against hers, "terrified of loving again, of losing again, of allowing myself to believe in second chances, but I am more terrified of letting you go." Behind them, a small voice broke the silence, and they turned to find Theo standing in the garden entrance in his nightshirt and borrowed boots, Lady Sabine hovering anxiously behind him. "Mother will stay?" Theo asked, and his voice trembled slightly with a fear that matched his father's, with the question of a child who had already lost one mother and could not bear to lose another. Evelora looked at this small boy who had recognized something in her that she had not known existed, looked at the man who had learned to hope again because of her presence, and felt something settle into place in her chest like a key turning in a lock. "Yes," she said, and the word came out steady and sure and final. "I will stay for as long as you both want me." Theo ran to her then, throwing his small arms around her waist, and Stefan wrapped them both in his embrace. And in the winter garden of Blackwood Hall, while snow fell softly around them and Christmas bells began to ring in the distance, 3 broken people found themselves made whole. The ballroom would talk for years about what happened that Christmas Eve, about the governess who became a duchess, about the silent child who spoke again, about love that defied every rule of propriety and precedent. But in that moment, wrapped in each other's arms beneath a winter sky, none of them cared what anyone else thought, because they had found what mattered most, a family born not from blood or obligation but from choice and courage and the simple miracle of being seen. Stop right there. Before you disappear, I need you to do few things for me right now. First, subscribe. If this story moved you, if you felt Evelora's pain and Stefan's hope and Theo's innocence, then subscribe now. Don't just enjoy the story and vanish. Support the creator who spent hours crafting every emotional beat, every tender moment, every word designed to make you feel something real. Second, rate this story on a scale of 1 to 10 inches the comments below. I'm genuinely asking, how did this story land for you? Was it a 7, an 8, a perfect 10? Tell me honestly, and more importantly, tell me which part grabbed your heart the hardest. Was it when Theo first said, "Mother"? When Stefan finally let himself hope again? When they all embraced in the winter garden? I need to know what resonated with you. Third, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I love seeing how these stories travel across the world, touching hearts from Lagos to London to Los Angeles. Our next video is going to be even more emotional. You do not want to miss it. Thank you for being here. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring about these characters as much as I do. Now go hit that subscribe button before you forget. See you in the next story.